I was rinsing the last coffee cup when my phone lit up on the counter, the glow cutting through the dull morning light. A single line appeared. No greeting, no softness, no cushioning for the blow. You won't be joining us on the family trip. My wife prefers to keep it just her family. I stood still, the cup in my hand cooling under the stream of water. I read it again, slower this time, as if the shape of the letters might change if I gave them enough patience. But they didn't. They stayed exactly as they were. A clean, bloodless cut. The tap kept running. A bead of water slid down my wrist and fell onto the floor. I watched it darken the tile. 2 nights ago, I had packed small cloth bags for each grandchild. I'd tied ribbons to the zippers, tucked in sun hats, miniature bottles of sunscreen, keychains with their names pressed into the metal. I'd wrapped them in tissue paper, so the surprise would last for at least a few seconds before eager hands tore them open. They sat now on the chair by the door, still waiting, still believing they were wanted. I didn't open the next message right away. I didn't need to. I already knew the tone it would carry. When I finally did, it was exactly what I'd expected. Don't take it the wrong way, Mom. It's not personal. It's just simpler this way. Simpler. The word hung in the kitchen like steam. Simpler than having me there. Simpler than arranging one extra seat at the table. Simpler than the truth. I set the phone down on the counter, screen down. My hands didn't shake. Not yet. I reached for the dish towel, dried the cup, placed it upside down on the rack. The motions were deliberate, careful. If I moved slowly enough, maybe the moment wouldn't fully arrive. But it already had. 2 years of saving for this trip. Cutting corners on groceries. Selling the dining table I'd had since my wedding day. Working part-time evenings when I should have been resting. Every dollar funneled into a fund for this 1 week. A week I thought we'd spend together. I picked up the phone again, typed one word back. Okay. It looked small on the screen. Then I put it face down and turned off the tap. The sink was empty, but the sound of water seemed to linger, as if something had been left running inside me. The house was still. Not the warm, drowsy stillness of a late morning, but a kind that pressed against the walls, making the air feel thicker. I stood at the edge of the kitchen, my palms flat against the counter, staring at the chair by the door where the gift bags sat, bright and cheerful, like they hadn't yet learned the truth. The sun had just begun to slip past the curtain edge, casting a thin gold stripe across the tiled floor. It caught on the corner of the rug I'd bought last year, the one I thought would make the room feel more like home for when they visited. They never mentioned it. I suppose they didn't notice. Everywhere I looked was something I'd chosen for them. The set of mixing bowls Matthew once admired in a catalog, so I bought them in case he wanted to bake when he came over. The curtain fabric Emily had called soothing, so I ordered it, stitched it myself, and hung it before their first dinner here as a married couple. The photographs on the walls. Disney, Cancun, the Christmas cabin. Every trip funded by me, though I never appeared in the frames unless someone insisted. I used to believe these things added up to love. That if I kept giving, the distance I felt growing between us would shrink again. But love doesn't work like that. Love is not a ledger. And yet I had kept making deposits, hoping one day I could withdraw a little warmth. I turned toward the hallway. Even there, the evidence of my giving lingered. The umbrella stand I bought so they wouldn't track water into the living room. The hallway table where Emily once placed a vase of flowers for me, but left the price tag on the bottom. Little reminders that generosity in our family had become a one-way street. I thought of the housewarming last spring, when I'd handed them the keys to the fully paid home I bought in their name. Emily had clasped my hands, eyes shining with what I thought was gratitude. "You'll always have a room here," she'd said. I'd believed her because mothers believe. Now I understood. The room she offered wasn't a room. It was a temporary shelter. A place until they decided I no longer fit their picture. The clock above the stove clicked once, marking a minute I would not get back. In the silence, I finally recognized it. This was not my kitchen anymore. This was not my home. I had built a museum of bad choices, and every exhibit bore their fingerprints. And I was done curating it. The phone rang just after noon, its sharp tone breaking the stale quiet. I almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. But habit is a stubborn thing, and I still answer calls like there's a chance they might bring good news. Mrs. Gardner. The voice was male, polite, professional. This is Mr. Whitaker from your bank. I wanted to confirm a few recent transactions. Something in his tone made me straighten. What kind of transactions? Several fund transfers, he said, mostly to cover ongoing home renovations. He paused, as if giving me time to place the expense in my memory. Significant ones. Large sums earmarked for design upgrades and contractor prepayments. I gripped the receiver tighter. Renovations. The word felt foreign in my mouth. On which property? The residence belonging to Matthew and Emily Gardner. Cold pulse moved through me. And who authorized these transfers? There was a brief hesitation. Well, technically you did. At least, your authorized representative account did. My stomach turned. Which representative? Your secondary authorized user, Mrs. Emily Gardner. His voice dipped, apologetic. She processed the transactions under the durable power of attorney you signed last spring. Closed my eyes. I could see that afternoon clearly. The notary Emily brought with her, the smile she wore as she slid the papers toward me. Just in case of an emergency, she'd said. It will make things easier. I'd believed her. Because mothers believe. Flag any further transactions for my review before processing, I said, my voice steady now. I'll be handling my accounts personally from here on. Of course, Mrs. Gardner. When the call ended, the silence returned, heavier this time. It pressed into the corners of the kitchen, into the small gap between the curtain and the wall, into the spaces where family used to live. It was no longer a question of being left out of a vacation. This was something else. Something planned. Emily wasn't just helping manage my affairs. She was arranging them. Positioning herself for a time when she and Matthew could quietly siphon everything I had worked for. Using that house as the crown jewel. My retirement was not their inheritance. Not yet. But they were already spending it like it was. I glanced toward the windowsill, where my late husband's locket rested. Richard would have seen through this sooner. He would have told me to be careful. I picked up the locket, ran my thumb over the date engraved inside. The day we paid off our first home. Back when Matthew was still just a boy building treehouses, not schemes. For years, I had made myself small to keep the peace. But love without respect is just a prison. And I had just found the key. By late afternoon, the walls of the house felt too close, the air too stale. I put on my coat and walked to the park, the same way I had on countless Sundays with Richard. Back then, he'd carry a folded newspaper under one arm, and I'd bring a paper bag of breadcrumbs for the ducks. We had our spot, a weathered bench under the wide branches of an old oak tree. He used to call it our corner of calm. The oak was still there, though the bark had darkened and thickened, and its roots pushed higher through the soil. I sat down, letting my hands rest on my knees, the way I did when I wanted to listen. The wind carried the smell of damp earth and distant barbecue smoke from someone's backyard. A dog barked somewhere beyond the tennis courts. It all felt far away, like the noises belonged to another life, one I wasn't part of anymore. I reached into my coat pocket and found the locket again. The metal was cool against my skin. I opened it carefully, though I didn't need to. Inside was the same tiny photograph of us taken the summer after our 30th anniversary. My hair was longer then, and Richard's laugh had been caught mid-breath. We looked like people who thought the hard part was behind them. You would have seen it, Richard, I whispered, my voice low enough that the wind could take it. You would have warned me. I traced the engraved date again, the day we paid off our first home. Back when every dollar saved felt like building a wall of safety around our family. I used to think we were laying a foundation that would keep Matthew safe for the rest of his life. I never imagined that same foundation would be used to corner me. The bench creaked under my weight. I could almost see him there beside me, one hand resting over mine, telling me I was stronger than I thought. He used to say, "Love is protection, but respect is the roof that keeps it standing. I stayed there until the shadows stretched long across the grass. My fingers were stiff with cold when I finally stood. On the walk home, I felt the beginnings of something unfamiliar. Heavier than anger, lighter than grief. It was clarity. By the time I reached my street, I knew I wasn't going to wait for them to take the next step. I'd spent years on defense. It was time to move forward. Tomorrow I'd start. Quietly. Precisely. The next morning, I was parked outside my attorney's office before they'd even unlocked the door. The street was still half asleep. Shop windows dark, a delivery truck idling at the curb, the faint smell of fresh bread drifting from the bakery 2 doors down. I sat in the car with my hands folded over my purse, the locket tucked inside, and waited for the clock on the dashboard to click over to 8 o'clock. Mr. Dalton had handled my affairs for years. He'd overseen the purchase of the house I'd given Matthew and Emily, drawn up my will after Richard died, even reviewed the paperwork Emily had so kindly, too kindly, urged me to sign for convenience. I'd trusted him, trusted her, trusted all of them. Not anymore. When the receptionist finally unlocked the glass door, I stepped inside. The office smelled faintly of lemon polish and paper. Old, safe scents. Dalton emerged from his inner room with his usual warm smile, but I saw the flicker of concern in his eyes. "Olivia, I didn't expect to see you this early. Is everything all right?" I sat across from him at the oak desk, placing my purse beside my chair. My voice was steady, but there was no softness in it. "I need to reverse the house gift." He blinked. "You mean the property you transferred to Matthew and Emily?" "Exactly that. I want it undone. I want my assets locked down, all financial powers revoked, and every paper trail documented." For a moment he hesitated, not in disagreement, but in recognition of what this meant. "Olivia, this may create tension." "They've already created it," I said flatly. "I've just been too blind to see it." He studied me, then nodded. "Very well. We'll proceed. And one more thing," I added. "I want a full record of any financial activity initiated through my accounts. Every withdrawal, every transfer, every authorization Emily processed. I don't care if it's $10 or 10,000. A shadow of approval crossed his face. "We'll need that if this escalates." "It will," I said simply. He leaned back. "You may also want to hire a private investigator." I raised an eyebrow. "You think it's that serious?" "Emily is not just overstepping. She's positioning herself for long-term control. If she's already tampering with accounts, she's likely building a paper trail for future claims. You'll need your own." The idea sat in my stomach like a stone, but it wasn't fear. It was readiness. "Hire whoever you trust," I said. He nodded once, already making notes. "We'll handle the legal protections. They'll handle the rest." When I left the office, the air outside felt sharper. Not cleaner, just more honest. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for their next move. I was making mine. The following morning, a pale rectangle lay on the kitchen floor, just inside the door. It must have slid through the mail slot while I was in the shower. At first, I thought it was a bill or an advertisement, something harmless, forgettable. Then I saw the handwriting on the sticky note attached to it. Emily's neat, careful script. "Just sign whenever you're ready, Mom. It'll make everything easier while we're away." The words curled in my stomach like something spoiled. I bent down and picked up the envelope. It was heavier than it looked, the paper thick and expensive, professional. I could smell the faint, sterile scent of printer ink before I even opened it. Inside was a neat stack of documents, clipped together at the corner. The first page was friendly enough. "Updated estate forms, streamlined for your convenience." I knew this trick. Emily had always been skilled at dressing control in the language of help. Kept reading. Halfway through, buried under paragraphs of harmless legal phrasing, I saw it. 3 lines that shifted the air in the room. Permanent. Irrevocable. A full power of attorney. It would give Emily complete legal control over my finances, my property, my medical decisions, my life. The pen marks on the signature line were faint, as though she'd pressed it against another paper to check the space. She'd been sure I would sign. I set the papers on the table and stared at them. The hum of the refrigerator grew louder, the ticking of the kitchen clock sharper. This wasn't just about the house anymore. It wasn't about the vacation. This was about taking everything now. I thought of the last conversation we'd had before they left for their trip, Emily's voice bright but empty. It's just simpler this way. And I realized simplicity had never been the goal. Ownership had. I slid the papers back into the envelope and tucked it into the drawer where I kept old receipts and unused keys. Not to hide them but to keep them close. Evidence. From the window, I could see the house I'd bought them, its blinds drawn tight. They were already halfway to their destination by now, floating somewhere between coasts, thinking everything at home was safe, that I was quiet, compliant. They thought wrong. I poured myself a cup of tea and let it cool beside me, untouched. My eyes stayed on the envelope in the drawer. It sat there like a loaded weapon. I had no intention of signing. But I would keep it because one day soon, I would need to show someone exactly how far they'd been willing to go. 2 days later, my phone rang before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but I recognized it immediately. It was the contact Dalton had given me. My private investigator. I answered on the first ring. Mrs. Gardner. The voice was low, measured, but I could hear the weight in it. You might want to sit down. I was already sitting. Tell me. Your daughter-in-law recently listed the property as collateral for a second mortgage. She's already begun the pre-approval process with a private lender. Paperwork was filed last week. For a moment I didn't move. The steam from my tea curled upward and dissolved into nothing. They're borrowing against the house I bought outright? Yes, ma'am. As if it were theirs entirely. No mention of how ownership was transferred, no reference to the questionable power of attorney, and nothing about the other financial activity tied to your accounts. They presented it as a clear family gift. The lender seemed impressed by their strong family backing. I pressed my lips together until I could taste the faint trace of blood. They've already started spending money they don't have, I said quietly. More than that, he replied. They're building debt in your name, only they don't see it that way. In their minds, this is just the natural next step. If I hadn't started this process, you could have woken up one day to find the house sold, the accounts empty, and no legal recourse. The paper trail they're building would make it look voluntary. I sat very still. No rush of panic, no racing heart. Just a slow, precise awareness that the game had already begun. And I was late to the table. Do they have any idea you're aware of this? Yes. No, ma'am. As far as they know, you're still quietly at home. A small, humorless smile touched my lips. Good. Let's keep it that way. When I hung up, the quiet in the kitchen felt different. Not empty, sharper, more deliberate. I understood now that this wasn't passive neglect. It wasn't a case of them forgetting me. It was active removal, an erasure dressed up as care. They weren't careful because they thought I'd never looked too closely. They thought I was still the woman who would rather swallow her pride than cause a scene. They hadn't realized something yet. Once a woman like me says no, it's already too late for the other side. I took another sip of my tea. Had gone cold. That evening I didn't turn on the lights. The sun had slipped low enough to throw long shadows through the living room, stretching across the floor like they belonged to someone else. I sat in my chair by the window, the one Richard used to call the lookout, and let the world move quietly outside while my own thoughts settled into place. This was no longer a misunderstanding. No accident. No moment of poor judgment. It was theft. Carefully planned, quietly executed, disguised as help. For years, I'd told myself they just didn't know how their actions made me feel. That they were too busy, too stressed, too caught up in their own lives to notice how much I gave and how little they returned. But now I saw the truth, clear, simple, and cold. They had noticed. They'd counted on it. Counted on my silence, my willingness to smooth over discomfort, my instinct to avoid confrontation. I looked at the house across the street, its porch light already on. Inside, a family moved between rooms, shapes passing in and out of view, voices carrying faintly through open windows. That used to be my life. The bustle, the noise, the feeling of belonging to a group that wanted you there. Now, my own home felt like a staging ground, neutral territory waiting to be claimed by whoever held the boldest pen. I leaned back and thought about the moment Emily slid that envelope under my door. How certain she must have been that I'd sign without reading. How she had probably told Matthew it was all taken care of before they even left for the cruise. The arrogance of it didn't make me angry. It steadied me. Because arrogance has edges. And when you know where those edges are, you can cut right through. They thought they were playing a long game. But they'd mistaken me for a piece on the board when I was, in fact, holding my own set of rules. Outside, a car passed slowly, its headlights sweeping over my front window. The beam caught the bare spot on the mantel where a framed photo of their housewarming used to sit. Taken it down weeks ago. The empty space suited me. I reached for my notebook, the one I kept for grocery lists and reminders, and turned to a fresh page. At the top, I wrote one word in block letters. Timeline. If they were going to take what was mine, they would have to do it on record. And I would be the one keeping it. That night, I didn't bother with the lamps. The only light in the room came from the street lamps outside, their yellow glow spilling across the sidewalk and cutting faint lines through the blinds. I sat in the dark, my hands folded in my lap, and watched as the neighborhood settled into its evening rhythm. Somewhere down the street, a door closed with a soft thud. Porch light flicked on. A child laughed and was quickly hushed by a parent. Ordinary sounds, the background hum of a life that still belonged to other people. Mine was quiet, too quiet. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that feels like absence. I thought about the years I had filled this house with noise. The clatter of breakfast dishes, Matthew stomping in from the yard with muddy shoes, Richard whistling while he fixed a drawer. Even after Richard died, I tried to keep it alive, inviting them over for dinners, filling the table with too much food, pretending not to notice how quickly they left after dessert. Now I could hear my own breathing. Even the refrigerator seemed hesitant to hum, as though it, too, understood that something had shifted. Across the street, a neighbor pulled into their driveway. The sweep of headlights flashed across my walls, briefly illuminating the empty mantel. It had been weeks since I'd removed that housewarming photo. At first, I'd told myself I was just making space for something new. Now I knew I'd been erasing them, piece by piece, long before they'd finished erasing me. They thought I would crumble under the weight of exclusion. They thought their polite cruelty would keep me compliant, as it always had. They didn't understand that silence works both ways. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and let my eyes adjust to the dark. The street outside looked different without color. Sharper, cleaner. You see the shapes more clearly when you're not distracted by the gloss. That was what this had become. A stripping away of gloss. No more excuses, no more softening the edges for their sake. Just the plain outline of what was happening. They had built their plans on the assumption that I would keep holding the walls up for them. But I had already stepped away. From my window I could still see their house. The blinds were shut tight, the windows dark. I imagined the papers stacked on their kitchen counter, their confident plans sitting right beside the fruit bowl. I sat back in my chair, the shadows settling over me like a second skin. Let them think the night was still. It wasn't. It comes back to me sometimes, uninvited, the other story. A different house. A different kitchen. A different kind of betrayal. It was 2 years ago. I'd been standing at the sink, just like now, drying a mug when my granddaughter, 17, hair like her mother's and eyes that didn't bother to look at me, asked for $5,000. For a bag, she said, scrolling through her phone. It's not even that much, Grandma. Thought she was joking. I even laughed, a small, surprised sound. But her face stayed flat, her thumbs still moving over the screen. I don't think that's something I can help with, honey, I said gently. She sighed, a deep, theatrical thing like I'd failed some important test. Everyone at school has one. God, never mind. You're just useless. The word landed heavy, but before I could answer, my daughter walked in. She must have been listening. You said no. Her voice was sharp, already wound tight. Yes. It's just a bag. The plate hit the wall before I could finish. Ceramic burst into the backsplash, shards skittering across the counter. My ears rang with the sound. You're worthless without money, she screamed. You think you're owed something because you raised me? 'Cause you babysat a few times. Get out. You're not needed here. I remember looking around that kitchen. The table I bought after her divorce. The fridge covered in photos I'd taken. The cabinets I'd helped pay to refinish. It didn't look like my daughter's kitchen. It looked like my work. My care. My years. I didn't argue. I didn't slam the door. I just took my purse, my sweater, and left. My hands were still damp from the dishwater. I didn't even take off the apron. It was raining when I got to the driveway. Not a downpour, just a steady mist that settled into the fabric of my clothes. I checked the time, 3:47 p.m., as if noting it would make sense of the moment. No one followed me. Not my daughter. Not my granddaughter. That night, I stayed in a motel with beige walls and a flickering light above the sink. I lay on top of the thin blanket, apron still around my waist, and stared at the ceiling until morning. That was the night I learned that family can close a door without looking back. And that once they do, the only person left to open it for you is yourself. It was almost a week after that night in the motel when I found myself standing at the counter in the county clerk's office. The woman behind the glass was young enough to be my granddaughter. She didn't look up when she asked, "What can I help you with today?" I slid the form across. Property records. 214 Minton Avenue. My name is Evelyn Harper. She clacked away on the keyboard, chewing her gum like it kept her alive. You the owner or the co-signer? I hesitated. That's what I'm here to confirm. Her eyebrows lifted for the first time. Let's find out. The printer hummed and spat out 3 pages. She slid them to me under the glass like they were nothing more than a receipt. I scanned them, my hands trembling just enough to make the text blur. There was, in black and white, primary owner, Evelyn Harper. Secondary, Danielle Harper. She never finished the transfer. For all the years she walked around calling it her house, telling friends I was lucky she let me stay, she had never filed the final deed. The property was still mine. Legally entirely mine. I closed my eyes for a moment, pressing the papers flat against the counter so the shaking wouldn't show. It was like discovering a door you thought had been locked was still standing wide open. All those years of her side comments. The "don't forget, this is my home now." The "you're lucky I don't charge you rent." Every word built on a lie. She was never the owner. She was a guest. Later that day, I met my oldest friend, Lorna, at the same cafe we'd been visiting since our kids were in diapers. I slid the papers across the table. She read them slowly, her silver curls bobbing with every shake of her head. "Well, sugar," she said at last, "the Lord works in documents and deadlines. That's what I always say." It was the first laugh I'd managed in days. "She's going to lose her mind when she finds out," Lorna added, sipping her tea. "Let her. She's gotten too comfortable treating you like a doormat. Maybe it's time she remembers who bought the damn door." Her words settled into me like a stone in still water, small but sending ripples in every direction. By the time I walked back to my car, the papers folded neatly in my bag, I knew I wasn't going to wait for the next insult. This time I had something they couldn't twist, proof. Paul's office was colder than I expected. Not unwelcoming, just stripped of anything unnecessary. Neutral walls, neutral carpet, one small plant in the corner that looked better cared for than I had been in years. He didn't waste words. "Let's talk about what's yours," he said after we shook hands. I laid the property records on his desk. He read them quickly, his eyes steady, not moving to gauge my reaction. When he looked up, there was the faintest trace of satisfaction in his expression. "She never filed her end," he said. Legally, you are the sole owner. No lease, no signed transfer, no recorded sale. You've allowed her to live there, but that's all. The words felt like bricks being lifted from my chest. Oh. I can ask her to leave. Yes. But you do it by the book. 30-day notice to vacate, sent by certified mail. Keep copies of everything. No texts, no shouting matches. Just documentation. That word stuck in my mind, documentation. Sounded less like confrontation and more like control. She'll twist it, I said. Tell people I've lost my mind, or that I'm being manipulated. She might, Paul agreed. But paper doesn't lie. And paper is what judges read. I nodded slowly, picturing the envelope I would send. My name on the return address, hers on the recipient line. I imagined her tearing it open, expecting something casual, only to find the formality of an official notice. She won't leave quietly, I added. Then we prepare for that, he said simply. Quiet isn't just for peace. It's for precision. You wait. You gather everything. Bank statements, property records, any messages where she claimed ownership or pressured you. When you're ready, you send it. And then you hold your ground. I left his office with a folder tucked under my arm, my steps slow but certain. The late afternoon light was thin, winter pale, the kind that makes everything look a little sharper around the edges. At home, I cleared the kitchen table, spread the documents out in neat rows, and began making a list. Dates, amounts, quotes from conversations I'd never forget. The pen moved easily across the page. This wasn't rage. It wasn't revenge. It was the slow, methodical work of reclaiming something that had been mine all along. By the time the sun dipped below the rooftops, I'd finished my list. I slid it into the folder and set it in the center of the table. They had gambled on my silence. Now they would learn what silence can do.